If you had to get a load of lithium, Nick, by next week, if you had to get a load of lithium, where would you get it from?
Well, I'll probably try and take a plane to Chile at the moment.
Yeah, are they selling their lithium or are they just being exploited?
Well, that's a very good question. But,
Previous track records are not good.
We're just letting people join now, just so.
Okay.
No worries.
Should we be joining a different call, or is this the one where
It'll be straight through? Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, we've got 20 so people have just started joining.
Okay.
So is Nick Richardson online at all?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Was that a yes?
Yep.
All right, cool. Oh yeah, there you go. So I was just explaining to the others, Nick, that we'll record this as we go along, and then we'll check with you that that's okay if you've got retrospective permission. And then I'll give a bit of an introduction at the beginning, and then I'll invite Ruth, then James, and then yourself to give a brief introduction about where you're positioned in all this at the moment. And that'll finish by about past. So you've got 4 or 5 minutes if you need it, and then we'll go over to questions from the audience, plus any questions from me, which if the audience is too slow. And then we finish 5 before 2.
Just give it another 2 minutes, I think, so people are still joining. So we've got. So I think I'll just kick off and do a quick intro, and then I'll hand over to you, Stuart. So hi everyone, welcome to today's Geological CO2 Storage and the Future of Oil and Gas Roundtable discussion meeting. My name's Amelia, I'm Head of Events here at the Society. Should you have any questions today relating to accessing Zoom, just contact conference@geolsoc or post in the chat and we'll be very happy to assist. Before I hand over to our fantastic chair and panelists for an action-packed hour, just to remind you that the Geological Society has a duty in the public interest to provide a safe, productive and welcoming environment for all participants and attendees at our events. So whilst attending this event, you must adhere to our event code of conduct at all times. This was shared to you in advance and we'll also be popping it in the chat as well. So thanks very much, and over to you, Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, and that's great, and welcome to everybody. And this is part of the Geological Society of London series of events on the energy transition, where the Geological Society has held several events looking at various features like the transition in energy from carbon to renewable and non-fossil fuels, and also looking at the strategic supply of minerals, and also, of course, on the different types of engagement which geoscientists and developers now have with communities, with organisations and with national governments. So it's not quite as simple, or very much not as simple as it used to be in the older days of 20 or 30 years ago. So today we're following on, we had a couple of events last couple of years on carbon capture and storage as a key component of the transition. And I am a Professor of Carbon Capture and Storage at the University of Edinburgh, and that's why I've been invited to try chairing this session today. So the aim of the event is to explore from 3 or 4 different perspectives what the transition into CO2 storage looks like, and particularly the role of the oil and gas industry as a major holder of subsurface expertise and a major developer of very large industrial scale subsurface projects. And we have three people representing not the oil industry, but representing different interest groups around the transition. So, and I'll invite each of those in turn to give a short statement in a few minutes. And Ruth Herbert is Chief Executive of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. James Tarleton is an analyst, senior analyst with the Climate Change Committee. And Nick Richardson is Head of Exploration and New Ventures in the North Sea Transition Authority. And so we'll hear from those folks in a minute. And just I'll give you, because there's quite a large number of people, there could be a wide range of expertise on the call. I'll just set a little bit of context in that, of course, CO2 emissions from fossil fuels have become a culprit in climate overheating. And there's a huge amount of effort and conversation and negotiation gone on for the past 30 or 40 years about decreasing CO2 emissions. And that's at the moment not been terribly successful, though I am very interested in the International Energy Agency World Energy Outlook published last week, which is trying to demonstrate that there could be a decrease of CO2 increase, a decrease or slower rate of CO2 increase. And the International Energy Agency claims that we could be approaching peak hydrocarbon production, and we could be approaching peak carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that would be, of course, a very good thing for the world as a whole. But we've had a long wait to get where we are now, where we're seeing in several continents industrial scale carbon capture and storage start to develop. And so in the European continent, there's a target of 50 million tons a year CO2 disposal capacity by 2030. Norway are making the first commercial offers to import and store carbon dioxide. The United States has its Inflation Reduction Act, is now paying money to projects which want to store carbon dioxide or use carbon dioxide, both captured from the atmosphere or captured from industrial processes. And that translates to about 40 million tons a year suite of projects at the moment. And then in the UK, of course, we're doing it slightly differently. We are making our own way through this, and we have a target of about 30 million tons of carbon dioxide by 2030. And last week, recently passed an energy bill in the UK to try enabling carbon capture and storage amongst many other energy strands. So an unprecedented level of activity around the world, an unprecedented transition of great complexity, and a huge target trying to get towards global net zero by mid-century 2050. So that's my feeling of the background. And I'll pass over to each panelist in turn to give a short statement on how they see the situation from their perspective. And first of all, I'll ask Ruth Herbert to speak. She's Chief Executive for the Carbon Capture and Storage Association based in London, which also has taken a leading position in Europe. And Ruth has a background previously in government, energy government in the UK, but has been judged it well enough to arrive as Chief Executive for the Trade Association in a huge expansion of membership and interest in CCS. So over to Ruth for a few minutes of presentation.
Thanks, Stuart. And I think maybe I'll start there in terms of a little bit about the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. We have seen huge membership growth. It's interesting in terms of who those companies are. A lot of our newest members are industrials, so they're companies that are making things that we all use and urgently looking for how to decarbonize, and seeing that carbon capture and storage is a method that can work for them, particularly the cement and lime industries, particularly energy from waste, refineries, chemical sector essentially. And I think this is really where carbon capture and storage is seen as essential and recognised as essential by a lot of organisations, not just us as an industry body, but actually those companies joining our association to try to become part of the networks that are emerging around the UK and across Europe, which are essential to their survival in a net zero economy. So I think it's really an exciting time, and we're now seeing that demand pull through from those sectors. Clearly, the issue is how are they going to continue to compete internationally where they're exposed to international competition with the added cost of carbon capture and storage, and this is really where governments come in. But just in terms of kind of how many projects are we talking about here? Well, just for the UK, we have got an office in Brussels as well, as you mentioned, but we've done an update on the UK market, which is sort of just over a year since we last did that in March 2022. And there are around 90 capture projects under development around the UK. So it's a growth of about a third on the number of projects this time in, March last year. And that represents about 94 million tonnes a year. Now, they're not all going to be operational. These are all looking to be operational by 2035. And only a proportion of those that would be operational by 2030. But I still think this is a huge growth in the pipeline. And these are projects that are anything from kind of very early ideas through to kind of projects that are doing their FEED studies and starting to and have already ordered major items and things. So there is a real range of development, obviously, across that pipeline. And that sort of brings me really, I suppose, to clusters and what's happening in the UK, which is the development of clusters where multiple such sites, whether they are industrial, power or even hydrogen production with carbon capture and storage, they are normally in the UK largely sited around the coastal regions where they have access to ports for exporting their products and so forth. And therefore, they're kind of aptly suited to sharing transport and storage infrastructure. And we have 12 such clusters in development, and I use the term clusters quite broadly to mean both kind of hubs of emitters, so hubs of industrial and power and so forth, that perhaps aren't close to a store, for example, like South Wales or Avonmouth, but also stores that are there, and maybe there may be greenfield industrial sites that might come there, such as Morecambe, for example, or they might connect to hubs inland or other clusters as well. And the clusters in the government programme, which are around the UK at the moment, we have the north west of England HyNet cluster in the Liverpool Bay area. We have the northeast, which is the Teesside and Humber, so the East Coast cluster there. And then they're in the track one. And then we have track two, the Scottish cluster around the Acorn site offshore, and the Humber, the Viking, for the Viking store. So these are the 4 clusters in the government programme. Only the first 2, HyNet and East Coast cluster, have projects that are actually in negotiation, capture projects that are in negotiation with the government. There are 8 projects across the 2 clusters in negotiation for contracts for difference that will pay the cost of the carbon capture and storage. The energy bill, which you mentioned, which is just going through, contains the powers for both the economic license that will be provided to the transport and storage provider, which will allow them to charge a cost per tonne supplied into the network for transport and storage. And then also the powers for the government to sign the contracts for difference with the capture projects, which will pay a proportion of that top-up cost through to the transport and storage provider. So it provides a whole system essentially for driving deployment of carbon capture and storage, but we still only have 8 projects that are currently kind of confirmed as moving forward. So out of 90 that want to move forward by 2035. So a huge task ahead of us. And as you say, the 30 million tonnes a year target for 2030 is quite challenging, and the projects going forward at the moment are maybe close to perhaps not even a third of that, and it does obviously take several years to get going. So they may be operational 27, 28. We've got the other two clusters needing to come in by 2030, and additional capture projects within the first two clusters also need to come in. So everything really needs to move in parallel now to meet the 2030 target, and we're encouraging the government to move much more quickly for the allocation of the CFDs if they want to meet that target. And then we've got to double that for 2035. So you see the challenge. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth, for that. And I think that gives an introduction to the unprecedented pace which is happening in the UK, but also that unprecedented pace is clearly still much too slow if we're going to satisfy the industrial demand for all these projects. And also from an environmental climate perspective, that pace of CO2 capture is also quite slow in the trajectory we need to get to net zero. And one of the things which is missing, no fault of Ruth, is removals of CO2 from the atmosphere, greenhouse gas recovery or direct air capture. And I'll pass over in a minute to Jamie to talk about the Climate Change Committee simulations and modelling of that. But up to now, my perception, my received wisdom has been that all pathways into net zero will require some carbon removals. So I'm also particularly interested in yet another new industry being developed in the UK. I mentioned to the audience, we have a Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. If you have questions or commentary on anything that's going on, please enter it into the Q&A, and then I can pick that up after the panelists have spoken. So please enter your questions. No question is too stupid. That's what we're here for, is to try and help people to understand a bit more. So I'll pass away from Ruth now, and if Jamie Talton can come online. Jamie's senior analyst with the Committee on Climate Change, and that is a body funded by UK government, but at arm's length from the UK government, whose role it is to provide independent scrutiny, advice and evidence about how the UK government is actually doing in practice with its enacting plans for the transition towards net zero. So the committee can be occasionally helpful, but sometimes is also quite critical. So interested to see what Jamie has to say here. Over to you.
Thank you. Just to check before I begin, can you see the slides that I've just started sharing?
I don't know.
I do, yeah, I can see them.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, so I've been asked today to give a summary on our kind of vision for how CCS, oil and gas can all play a part in the transition to net zero. So this is something that we did a lot of modelling on back in 2020. So the focus of that work was to advise the UK government on their sixth carbon budget target, where basically what we did was we made a series of 5 different pathways of different ways to get to net zero. And then one of those 5 was basically a compromise of the other 4, and then use that compromise pathway, which is we call the balanced pathway, to advise what the target should be in order to kind of make sure that we're on track for net zero, basically. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how CCS, oil and gas all fit into those pathways, both in terms of how they vary between the pathways, but then for the balanced pathway to kind of zoom in and show that sectoral breakdown, and show how much CCS is happening in each of the different sectors, how much oil and gas is being used by each of the different sectors. So I'll just move to the next slide. Okay, so to start with CCS, so this shows our 5 different pathways of CCS usage from now up to 2050. So 2 big things to say here. Firstly, there's quite a range of how much CCS we see could be done in 2050. This is because CCS is one technology, or depending on how you look at it, several technologies that can be used to decarbonize. There are other technologies that can be used, and often, you know, it's a choice between different things, between different options. But another thing I would say is that all of our pathways, as you can see, involve a substantial amount of CCS. You know, starting from 2025 out to 2050. So we definitely see CCS as, you know, an essential part of the transition to net zero. And then to look at the sectoral breakdown for our balanced pathway of where this CCS is happening, you can see in the 2020s that most of this demand is in the electricity sector. So this is you know, basically gas power with CCS as being used as a way to produce you know, relatively low carbon dispatchable electricity. But over time, other areas increase, and you can see in 2050, most of the use of CCS is by something called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is basically the burning of biomass, so trees and other energy crops, and then the capturing of the resulting CO2, you know, into the CCS system. But you can also see there's a substantial amount being used in fuel supply, which I think is mainly for hydrogen production with methane reformation, and also some in other sectors like industry, waste, and direct air capture, which Stuart mentioned before as well. So moving on to oil. Now, again, you can see that there's quite a range between our pathways in terms of how much oil consumption we have in 2050. But broadly, the picture here is a significant decrease from 2020 out to 2050. And I'll move on to the next slide to explain why. This is showing the sector breakdown for our balance pathway. You can see in 2020, as you might expect, most oil demand is in the surface transport sector. So, you know, this is the petrol and the diesel that we currently put into our cars. We see that surface transport is something that can be electrified relatively easily. And so we basically say that those emissions should go down to almost zero in 2050 as we transition away from petrol cars to electric cars. And you can see the residual in 2050 is almost all down to aviation, because this is something that's much harder to decarbonize. So you know, we do see a role for oil in the aviation sector in 2050, but across all the other sectors, the vast majority of it we think should be gone by 2050, basically. Now moving on to gas. This again, like for the last few slides, shows the decrease in gas demand from now out to 2050. You can see quite a range between our pathways in terms of the 2050 consumption. Again, the picture is broadly similar to oil demand in that, you know, we see a decrease from now out to 2050, but there is more of a potential role for gas in a net zero world, because there are potential applications where it can be used alongside CCS to mitigate the emissions, which is, you know, unlike for oil, which, as we just saw, is, you know, predominantly used in transport applications. Gas is often used in, you know, large stationary emitters, which can be decarbonized with CCS. You know, that's one possible option. So that's why we see a kind of, you know, greater residual here in terms of gas demand compared to oil. And this is my final slide, which is, like for the others, showing the sectoral breakdown of gas demand for our balanced pathway. I put a twist on this slide. I've added this black striping to show the areas where the gas usage is abated with CCS. So you can see, starting in 2020, we have most gas demand is in the building sector. So this is, you know, gas boilers, basically. Again, we see that as something that can be decarbonized over time with, you know, heat pumps and other low carbon forms of heat. But we do see potential application in 2050 with hydrogen supply, which I mentioned earlier, where, you know, methane can be used to produce hydrogen with CCS, and also with electricity supply, which I mentioned earlier, with gas power, and also in the industry sector as well. Yeah, and that's it for me.
Just remember to unmute. Thank you, Jamie. A complicated transition made to look very simple with lines on a graph. But of course, it's again difficult to guarantee any of that, and still quite a lot of that involves technologies which don't quite exist yet. And we'll hopefully come back to that in some of the questions later on. But I'll let Jamie rest for a little while and drink his tea, and we'll pass across to Nick. And Nick Richardson now will talk to us about his work with the North Sea Transition Authority, and as context to remind people that the UK, I think, is probably the first country in the world to license extensive CO2 storage licenses offshore. So there's been a very successful licensing round, very much along the lines of oil and gas style licensing, with bids in discussion between government or the Transition Authority and developers. And then those bids have been confirmed to developers within the past 2 or 3 months, I think. And so Nick must be deeply involved in all that. So I'll pass over to Nick, see how he views licensing, how he views regulating, how he views monitoring the performance of these CCS developments now and into the future. And also I'll probably touch on later the potential conflict between that and continuing oil and gas development, or maybe a synergy, Nick might say. Anyway, over to Nick.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Okay, good. So I'm head of exploration and new ventures. So my team deals with both petroleum issues and carbon storage issues. So from a regulatory point of view, there's quite a few parallels in terms of process and how we manage that, but also lots of other parallels in terms of the people actually doing the work and supply chain, etc. So from our point of view, it makes sense to run those things alongside. So I'm going to show some slides, some quite fleetingly. They are all on our website somewhere, and hopefully some will tie into some of the things that Jamie's been talking about as well. So I've got some of the lines that are on Jamie's charts are also on my charts. So first of all, NSTA, what do we do? So very briefly, we work in these 3 main areas: energy security. So we manage the oil and gas portfolio as it exists now. We are working towards reducing emissions from oil and gas installations through electrification, reducing flaring, venting, etc., but also working in other areas to try and accelerate the transition. So carbon storage is one of those areas. We're also in the Energy Act going to be the regulator for the offshore hydrogen transport and storage industry as well. So lots of key areas that we can help to pull together, and also working increasingly with other bodies across government to try and make sure that we do things in harmony with each other. So we work closely, for example, with Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland. Just for your awareness, there's this thing called North Sea Transition Deal, which lays out an agreement between the oil and gas industry and government with a number of targets within there. So some key things in terms of decarbonisation through emissions reduction, methane action plans, carbon capture and storage targets are also tied into that. Hydrogen targets, plus some targets in terms of supply chain and how we try and integrate local content into the activities as we go through that transition. In terms of UK oil and gas footprint, so you'll have probably seen this somewhere in the press in terms of LNG has a much larger footprint than UK domestic gas production. But from the point of view of emissions from upstream oil and gas operations, they equate to a substantial proportion of UK emissions, so 4% of total UK emissions. So one of the key things that we've been focusing on and continue to focus on is reducing those emissions associated with power generation offshore, because that's 70% of that 4%. So that's a key task that we have in terms of driving down emissions in the short term from current activities. Couple of charts here which show the balance of demand and supply for both oil and gas within the UK. So on the left-hand side, you can see the demand profile, which is the profile that Jamie was showing, the balanced pathway demand profile versus the production that we can see from existing fields. So that's the green profile, from undeveloped discoveries if they were to be developed, and from future discoveries. And you can see that Basically, from now all the way out to 2050 for oil and gas, there is a gap between those two profiles, so the demand and the supply profile. Worth pointing out that Norway is completely the opposite to this in terms of the relationship. So they use hardly any of their domestically produced oil and gas, and it's all exported. In terms of how that then stacks up to the transition, so here's a graph that lays the oil and gas demand and production on top of CO2 injection rates and how they compare over time. So you can see that there is this decline in both demand and production for oil and gas, but there's also a step up in terms of CO2 injection rates that we need to achieve to meet those balanced net zero pathways. So that has a number of implications for supply chain, for people working on activities, our ability to drill wells, to repurpose pipelines and infrastructure, etc. So quite a lot of work going on in terms of how do we actually manage that transition from one set of activities to another set of activities. So as Stuart mentioned, we recently announced awards from our first carbon storage license round. It's a fairly unique effort, I think, certainly in terms of Northwest Europe, to have a round of this scale. Resulted in the award of 21 licenses across relatively large areas, particularly in the southern North Sea. So you can see the newly awarded licenses in red there, with the existing licenses in green on that map. That means we have a pretty diverse portfolio across the UKCS. So we have both aquifer projects and depleted field projects. Some of those newly added projects could also potentially inject before 2030. I'll show you a graph in a minute that shows you what could happen. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we can actually get to the point of issuing permits. So lots of these licenses have well or seismic commitments associated with them. So some firm, some contingent commitments, and a fair amount of reprocessing and studies required before those licensees can get to the point where they can submit a permit to us. And then final slide here in terms of those pathways to net zero for carbon storage and what they look like. There's a graph on the top left-hand side. So that shows the balanced net zero pathway as well as the headwinds pathway. And then the purple dashed line is what we're being told by the applicants from the license round, from the track 1 projects and the track 2 projects in terms of rates that could be delivered from those projects. So the purple line is basically, if everything works out well and on time as we're being told, that's what could be delivered in terms of injection rates. However, we know that reality is not like that early on. So in the next 5 years or so, it's going to be pretty sensitive to a relatively small number of projects. And those projects are likely to either not reach permit, to under-deliver, or to be delayed in some form. So once you apply a discount factor onto those, you can see that there is the possibility for the dashed blue line being the actual outcome, which may meet in the short term some of those targets, but in the longer term, we may find that actually we diverge from those pathways. So we need to ask ourselves what's required in terms of the portfolio, stewarding those projects and making sure that they do progress and have the support that's required. And then on the bottom graph, cumulative volumes you can see there from each of those scenarios. So 1.6 gigatons or 2.3 gigatons in the headwind scenario. We've done some work looking at how many stores we actually need to appraise to be able to deliver those volumes. So when you take into account failure rate, under delivery, variation of size of those particular stores, we potentially need to appraise 100 stores to make sure that we can deliver that balanced net zero pathway there. So it's not necessarily 100 stores need to be brought into operation, but we need to go through the process of licensing and appraising potentially up to 100 stores, but could be as few as 28, which would be encapsulated within the portfolio as it stands. So lots of work to do. I'd echo what Ruth was talking about in terms of pace and scale. We really need to make sure that the next years are the ones that we capitalise upon and deliver, not just for the UK, but potentially also make sure that we can deliver some of the options that could be provided to continental Europe, for example, in terms of import of CO2 into the UK. Okay, so I'll leave it there and wait for questions.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much, Nick. And again, that's a really good outline of where we're at and the whole distance we've come, and with phenomenal success, really. This rate of development, I think, is unique in the world. And remind the audience now, please enter your questions in the Q&A box, and I can read those, and I'll select questions and ask the panel questions as we go through. And so, pardon me, I'll start off with Jamie, because you mentioned on your graph, then you showed that the majority of CCS by 2050 would be, look like a lot of that would be applied to bioenergy. So that in other areas of the work which we'll do, that bioenergy is an extremely contested source of energy. So does the Committee on Climate Change have a view on if that should be sourced in the UK, should be exported, should be imported from North America, or where does it come from, and what safeguards should be involved in that?
Yeah, so so I'm not sure of the details of what we assumed in our sixth carbon budget work. I think we did assume some imports of biomass, but we did also, you know, recognize that it is a very limited resource, and as you say, very, you know, valuable in terms of, you know, it can be used for all sorts of decarbonisation activities, but it can only be used once, and, you know, there is a hard limit on how much land area there is, you know, on the planet, and various other things that we need to use that land for as well, you know, including food production and, you know, just people living and that sort of thing. So very much recognize the point that you're making, and, you know, I think at the time we kind of made that judgment of, you know, for the biomass that we were using in BECCS that I showed you on the graph, that was the kind of best use of that biomass. But, you know, that was not the only use of biomass in our pathways. We did have other applications as well. And yeah, we're you know, currently working on our seventh carbon budget analysis, which we're going to be publishing in 2025. And that is one of the things that we're considering is, you know, where is that biomass going to come from? How much should we be assuming that we can import and that sort of thing? And, you know, making sure that we, you know, we give a pathway that is possible, you know, not kind of assuming, you know, not having any unrealistic assumptions, basically.
Yeah, okay. So in a way, you've not gone into that in great detail, and that could be flexible depending on events, I guess, or what happens. So, but we'll still need to have those removals out of the atmosphere then, and CCS functions as the ultimate destination for that CO2. That you're flexible about whether those removals are bioenergy or engineered direct air capture.
I think, you know, so bioenergy, as you said, is limited. The advantage that it has over direct air capture is that it is significantly cheaper. Direct air capture is something which, you know, in principle is easier to, you know, scale up because it doesn't have that same hard limit on kind of land needed to produce it. But it is very expensive, and it is, you know, requires a lot of electricity, a lot of heat. So, you know, it's not, you know, direct air capture is not an easy fix. So yeah, that's why we kind of have that mix between the two technologies in our pathways.
Yeah. So even if there was a cost reduction pathway for direct air capture, you're seeing that as speculative, I guess, by 2050.
Yeah, I don't think I would necessarily use the word speculative. I think we do consider it to be something that will be possible. I mean, you can already see there are pilot projects that are already happening now even.
Yeah.
So I think we see it as a technology which, you know, obviously requires further development, but we are confident that it will exist in some form and that it will be possible to do some direct air capture.
Great, okay, thanks very much. I'm going to pass on to Ruth for a couple of questions. And so, Ruth, then you mentioned that you'd had a big increase in membership, of course, and those people are engaged and hopeful of obtaining work and business out of CCS developments, but how you then contrasted that with the relatively slow pace of actual enacting real projects. So I'm just wondering how are you going to keep those members engaged from your perspective, and how should the UK government in particularly try and give some confidence that they are going to gain something out of CCS?
Yeah, I think, and just picking up on one of the comments in the chat actually from John Underhill, I think our members can see the global market here, and they can see the pace of development of CCUS globally. And so they are going to be active in this next 10-year period, like extremely active and scaling up and delivering as many projects as they can. The question is how much of that will be in the UK. And I think for the UK has previously been a leader in this area for many years, alongside Norway. Some of the other North Sea Basin countries have been quite proactive, as well as the US and Canada and Australia, to name a few regions. I think really where we are now is, you know, we're dropping behind simply because we haven't got stuff built. We missed a really great opportunity, obviously, with the first competition back in 2007-8, and it may have been, you know, it wasn't for a cluster, it was for a point-to-point solution. But I think if we'd have done that, I mean, it was on coal, which was not popular at the time, but is still probably going to be the technology that China uses. That will be, we would have been on our third generation of project by now. We'd have done another two rounds probably. So we have lost a lot of time, really, just due to political decision making and economic problems and so forth. The technology is there. I think scaling up, all the projects that have scaled up have learned quite a lot. I think there's a lot of learning that need to be done, and it will need to be shared quickly. So that's a challenge. To keep people engaged, I think the CCUS vision that the government's coming out with by the end of this year is going to be quite important, which has got to show how we're going to reach that kind of 2035 level of deployment. And that means what happens beyond the cluster program, what happens beyond the first 4 clusters. And this is, you know, really needing to look at what are the market mechanisms to drive deployment. So it moves away from being government controlled rollout, government picking each cluster and project to move forward sequentially, and more to a kind of unleashed deployment, which I guess more similar to what we see in the US. I would say that the US, though, is only that the tax credits are only delivering certain types of projects that are cheaper and easier to deliver. And the larger, more coordinated cluster type strategic infrastructure like we're developing does still require a lot of state and federal support and coordination. So I still think that initial infrastructure does require sort of that level of coordination. But I think there's a lot of smaller projects, energy from waste, small industrial projects that could get going if there was some kind of more automatic deployment mechanism that didn't require government projects.
Contrast, you know, my favourite contrast at the moment is to contrast the pace in the UK, which is taking about 9 years to produce a project, with the pace in Denmark, of course. You know what's coming. Yeah. Who can produce a project in 18 months. Do you think these are comparable, or do you think Denmark have only got part way to a CCS project?
It depends what you mean by project. So if you're just talking about the storage and so the storage project, then I think there are some real challenges. I mean, you know, it'd be interesting to get Nick's view on this, and we've talked about it before, but I guess we're all following the same like legal regime actually that comes from the Directive on Geological Storage of CO2, which I was involved negotiating when I was in government, which requires a storage permit. You know, between getting a storage license and getting a storage permit, there's quite a lot of steps to go through, make sure you've appraised the site properly and all the rest of it. Test injection, which is what they seem to be doing in Denmark, using CO2 from Belgium. So it's so they've proved proof of concept for cross-border CO2, which is great. It's small quantities. It's a kind of test period that's done for, and then it's not continuous, and it's not going to get up to the industrial scale that we're trying to deploy in the clusters in the UK, or even that the Netherlands, very close to doing. They've taken their final investment decision only just this month for the Porthos cluster. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think Netherlands are probably ahead, very far ahead. Denmark have proved a cross-border concept, which is helpful. What I'm interested in is how did they get very quickly to their test injection, much quicker than we seem to be able to get under our licensing process. But actually, in terms of the scale of what they've done and, you know, and so forth, and its contribution to climate change, it's still just I think really a small test case and a kind of proof of concept rather than an operational facility.
We're going to be comfortable that's a false dawn then, and we're actually really ahead from them.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we haven't even got a cross-border policy as the UK. So CCUS vision at the end of this year needs to say we're open for business on that front, which the government hasn't done yet. So no, they're definitely ahead on setting out their stall, as it were.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to pass across to Nick now. I know we've laid out a few bear traps for Nick to try and respond to. And so I've got one question about supremacy of licensing, of course, because on your map, we can see what a congested offshore area we have with licenses for CCS, potential licenses for CCS, wind developments, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's a conflict between an oil and gas operator, CCS operator, and or a CCS operator and a wind development operator, how's this going to be resolved by the NSTA?
Yeah, so some of those interactions are more difficult than others. So in terms of oil and gas versus CCS, I think there's a natural tendency for those projects to have different targets in mind. So you shouldn't really be injecting CO2 into something that's a producible oil or gas target. You know, one, there's a resource there, and two, it's probably not going to be the ideal place from a pressure and point of view. So although we have oil and gas licenses and CCS licenses overlying each other, I think generally they are looking at different targets in the subsurface, and then it becomes a kind of operational management issue. The more difficult interactions, I think it's fair to say, are between other activities and offshore wind. And offshore wind is fundamentally different from others because it takes up a very, very large area, pretty high density in terms of the wind turbines that are put in place. So you can't compare the area of a carbon storage license and a wind lease, because actually the carbon storage license is a very small proportion of the area that's actually going to be used at the end of the day. Now I think the trick is going to be making sure those projects talk to each other early and they have open dialogue. And we've seen that already with a couple of the projects that are in the planning stages. Is if everyone goes into this with the right mindset and they actually want to try and help each other to reach targets, then I think there are ways to manage those interactions. That's not always going to be the case, and there may need to be some sort of adjudication in terms of which has primacy. But I think some of the past experiences are not necessarily indicative of future experiences, and we've already got some cases whereby companies that have very different overall targets in mind in terms of wind versus storage activities or oil and gas activities have managed to come to arrangements whereby things are done slightly differently. Somebody reroutes a cable, somebody changes the way they're going to lay out a particular pipeline, somebody adjusts where they're going to put a particular installation, and then trying to look for some of the synergies that exist as well. So where can we repurpose some of the existing infrastructure? Where could we, for example, put some transformers onto some of the installations that already exist out there? Where can we repurpose pipelines for different uses? So I think we need to move from the space of automatically assuming there's a conflict to trying to work together to identify where there can be mutual benefits.
Mm-hmm. So if there was existing infrastructure, for example, you talked about maybe a pipeline or a transformer, would the newly arriving developer be liable for that cost of removal or readjustment, or are you looking to the incumbent to make some accommodation for the new industries coming in?
Well, there may have to be at some point some transfer of liabilities if somebody's taking on some piece of kit offshore to do something else with it. But there are also there are some obligations already that exist on oil and gas licensees. For example, they should be looking at repurposing of facilities for carbon storage. So that exists within the OGA strategy. So that I think there is a case for saying that there's a duty for those companies to try and use what they've got in terms of assets to help with the transition in various ways. And of course, there will have to be some sort of, in some cases, negotiations that need to take place in terms of liabilities and taxation, etc.
Okay, that's great. And I'm going to ask you then, the title of this whole meeting is really about the future of the oil and gas industry, and the way that you've outlined the approach in the UK and your department, if you like, or organisation, is very much borrowed or even perhaps cloned a lot of the approach to licensing and negotiation with obligations for CO2 drilling wells or seismic acquisition. So do you see that the oil and gas industry has an irreplaceable role in the future, or do you see that the oil and gas industry will maybe fragment into smaller specialist companies who develop CCS with a very specialist and perhaps lower overhead than existing oil and gas companies operate?
Well, I think for the foreseeable future, we've got a role for oil and gas within our economy, basically. Now, there are obviously going to be companies that have skills that should be applied to carbon storage activities, and that's what we're seeing with the licensees, is that the ones that are coming into licenses are the ones that have the ability to deliver large-scale projects, have access to reservoir engineers, have access to facilities engineers, and whether over time they become purely focused on carbon storage activities is a question. I think probably the answer is going to be yes, but I think the dominance is going to be, for the foreseeable future, companies that have a mix of oil and gas interests and a set of carbon storage interests as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the dominance at the moment seems to be that the majors are the ones, together with some of the mid-scale companies that are making the running there. So that's I think going to be the case for the foreseeable future. But at some point, I think there's the space for other more specialist companies to come into the mix there. Obviously, there are companies like Storiga, for example, who have been focused on carbon storage activities, but it's where they can partner up with companies that also have the ability to deliver those projects at scale and at the pace that's required. I think that's going to be critically important to recognise that as well.
Yeah, okay. And so I guess after this first wave of projects, what Ruth calls track 1 and track 2, the projects, which 4 clusters which are named, would you expect to see a widening out of companies being interested as lead developers, or would you expect to see those very big majors take up a lot more acreage and a lot more leadership quite rapidly once the first concepts have been demonstrated?
Well, I think some of this is going to be laid out, as Ruth mentioned, in the vision that DESNZ are going to be presenting towards the end of the year, is how to enable some of those merchant models.
Right.
So how do we make sure that these projects are less reliant upon government subsidy, but there's also going to be an element there of cross-border transportation, and that's not just a case of how can we resolve issues under the London Protocol from a UK perspective. It's also, well, how does the UK ETS system interact with the EU ETS system? What does the Net Zero Industry Act say about cross-border transportation outside of the European Union? What kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism systems are in place in various regimes, and how do they interact with each other as well? So I think, there are other models that exist. I think it's not just a case of the smaller companies are interested in those. I think some of the larger companies are also interested in cross-border transportation and synergies across the board of the government neighbours. But it's how to enable that so that whoever wants to invest can invest, and it's a proposition that makes sense.
Right. Okay, yeah, understood with that. I'm going to go back to Ruth again now to just pick up on that type of point, because we've seen BP and Shell as oil majors who are members of CCSA be quite enthusiastic for CCS, but then pull back because basically there's not enough profit in it. So if you compare the profits those companies could make as an obligation to their shareholders by producing oil and gas, the profits which they could make out of a regulated low margin business of CO2 disposal are not going to compare. One's probably double-digit percentages and one's single-digit percentages. So how do you see that impacting on the interest and the future of the oil and gas industry, interest of oil companies in the future of the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're in this to make money. They've got plenty of other ways of doing that. So yeah, this is really about future-proofing their business. This is about looking at how they can deploy their skills and assets, to try to address climate. I don't think that, I mean, as you say, I don't think the rates of return that you'll get from under these economic licenses are going to really be a driver for that investment. I think the opportunity to be a first mover in this and the scale of the global market and the presumption that exploration will go down over time and that this will go up over time is definitely a driver here. Do I think that's enough of a driver for them to do lots and lots of these projects all at once all around the world? Maybe not, but yeah, to try to be a first mover in a market that they feel reasonably confident in, then I think yes, it is sufficient. I'm sure they will agree a rate of return eventually. They won't be happy with it, but they will get there and they will do it, and they will and have dedicated significant amounts of their investment, their balance sheet, to do this when they could be making lots of money doing other things instead. So I think yes, they will get on, they will do it, but can we rely on that going forward as the thing that drives the scale and pace we need? I'm not sure. I think yes, allowing a degree of dual till type behavior, which we've discussed with the government, where they can take emissions from other sources as well as from those government funded capture projects, might help as well address kind of any unlock more investment in expanding those networks and in developing new networks outside of the government competition. Other deployment mechanisms, Nick's talked about carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think that would drive a huge volume of the capture pipeline that I've talked about to fruition, which if you can see those customers, those future customers are there, then you're more likely to go and invest in building some of the 100 stores that Nick said we're going to need. So I think there are things that could unlock more investment from those majors, but they need to be market-wide levers. We've also talked about mandates and product standards, and they could come into manufacturing, for example, across Europe through the CBAM or other regulations, and also standards on oil and gas production itself. So there's lots of things that could drive this more quickly. Certainly they need to be market-wide measures if we're going to get the kind of scale and pace that we need. But yeah, I mean, I think they are frustrated by the slowing of pace. I don't think industry has deliberately slowed things down. I think they've actually slowed them down because the government has slowed down and they don't want to be left exposed to investment that isn't going to come to fruition. But I think now, hopefully, we'll see a pickup.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to ask the last question quickly to James, because on your graphs, you basically showed, if from the UK perspective, that the oil and gas industry is not needed after 2050 because there's very little oil and gas to production or use in your future scenarios. So how do you think the oil and gas industry has a future in the UK or even globally, because those are global pathways. Those are pathways from a UK perspective. But how global is this decline of oil and gas going to be?
So, I mean, we focus on the UK, like that's our job. So we do consider the international picture, but not in as much detail as the UK. Every country will have their own decarbonisation pathway, both in terms of, you know, when they get to net zero and also like how they get there. That will be dependent on all sorts of local factors, which, you know, I couldn't even begin to comment on. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the point you made stands, that, you know, there is a pretty small amount of oil and gas consumption in our pathways by the time you reach 2050. I should highlight that all of these graphs I've shown are about the use of oil and gas, and not about the, you know, where that oil and gas is produced, you know, whether it's produced in the UK or elsewhere. But also, you know, the oil and gas market is a global market. So, you know, as Nick pointed out earlier, like a lot of our oil and gas ultimately comes from abroad. So, you know, when you're considering these things, you do need to consider the global picture as well.
Okay. And I think I'm going to stop because of time. Thank you very much, James, for your answer there. And I'll wrap up briefly by saying thank you to all three panelists for fairly and honestly representing your points of view and trying to answer the questions directly. I've obviously got multiple questions which have been asked and we couldn't get round to. So several people obviously wanted to know about the conflict between Rosebank and other oil fields and the use of oil and gas in petrochemicals or power. You know, we just haven't had time to cover everything in an hour. But I think it's clear that we're potentially at the start of a really dynamic, explosive growth in new industries of carbon storage in the UK, but it's not guaranteed. There are still lots of decisions to be made by government, and we should, if we're interested in using CCS as a climate mitigation tool, then we have to work with government and get behind government to advise them in keeping their foot on the accelerator, very much going faster and further, because the UK probably has a unique offer and pace to give of reliable carbon capture and storage for Europe and the world. So that's it. And I just mentioned, if anybody's interested in this wider energy transition theme from the Geological Society, Nick Gardner from St Andrews will give a public lecture on the 7th of November about sources of tin and sources of lithium for the energy transition, because of course we just talked about being limited by CO2 storage geology in this presentation, but of course be also limited by the other scarce metals and minerals we need for the energy transition. So thank you very much, everybody, and that's it. So goodbye and have a rest of your happy day. Have some lunch.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.